From the language app Babbel, this is Multilinguish. I'm producer David Duchin. When you think of languages, you probably think of something like Spanish, Dutch, English, Chinese, or Swahili, one of the world's roughly 7,000 languages that exist today, many of which have been around for centuries and followed a natural linguistic development, splitting off from other languages and evolving over generations. But did you know a language is something that you can just, make up? Chances are you've come across one too. Does this sound familiar to you? If you recognize this language, it might be because you're a diehard fan of the HBO series Game of Thrones. This language is one of the major ones created for the show. It's one language from one fictional universe, but there are plenty more out there. A whole world of languages that exist in your favorite TV shows, books, and movies, but not in the real world. Today, we explore the world of constructed languages, or conlangs. Who's making them and using them, and why go through the trouble of making one at all? And what real-world purposes do they serve, if any? In this episode of Multilinguish, we'll explore conlanging from two angles. First, we'll look at conlangs in pop culture and the people who are creating them and practicing them. Second, we'll talk about using constructed languages as a tool for global unity, focusing on one conlang in particular, Esperanto. And we'll discuss how practical it is to actually use a conlang like this in real life. Before we get started, make sure to rate and review Multilinguish wherever you listen. And don't forget to subscribe so you get new episodes as soon as they're released. All right, so first let's jump into actually talking about what a conlang is. To do that, I have the members of Babbel's content team here with me. Oh, a couple of them, not everyone. Aylin Askaloff, Steph Koifman, and Thomas Devlin. Hey, everyone.
Hi.
Hello.
Okay, so let's just kind of start by talking about what we think of when we think of a constructed language. Is there anything that comes to mind? Any examples that you would recognize maybe from your favorite TV shows or movies?
Well, I'm not someone who really follows Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or anything like that, but I know of Dothraki. I know of Valyrian. That's it.
Those are two really popular ones, especially over the past couple years. Yeah.
Lord of the Rings, bring that up, definitely. I don't remember all of them. I know J.R.R. Tolkien made like a ton.
Right.
Elvish being at least one, along with others. And I also read about this one constructed language called Lojban. I don't actually know how it's pronounced, but it's supposed to be this language that distills language into logical components. So it's like you can't say ambiguous things. And so when you say a sentence, it can only be interpreted one way. But that's not like a fun one. That's kind of just like, we're trying to do something new with language.
I want to see what like a love letter written in Lojban would look like.
There's no love in Lojban. It's like Newspeak. Oh, that's another one, actually.
Well, I mean, love isn't logical.
This is way deeper than I intended to get on this episode of Multilinguish.
We're going to save this one for Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
But also Newspeak. It's Newspeak, right?
Definitely. I think that's one I didn't even think of, but created for a fictional universe, has a very specific purpose. I mean, that's from literature from like the 50-some years, maybe even more than that, because 1984 was written, I think, in the 40s. So it's cool to think that people are crafting constructed languages, I mean, throughout history. Do you think of the ones today from like your favorite TV shows, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings originally, I mean, was a huge work of literature. But I think, I mean, you mentioned Elvish, Thomas. From Star Wars, there's like Huttese, the language of the Hutts, which I don't know if there's like a full, if you could go online and actually learn Huttese, but it exists, it's an idea that there is a language out there that's spoken by a very specific subset of characters, and I'm sure there are people out there who tried to learn them.
Have we said Klingon? I feel like
I was
that
just
one
going to
is...
say that, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So Klingon from Star Trek, another great example.
What about like Parseltongue?
Parseltongue, I'm not sure.
Are there Harry Potter languages?
I don't know. I don't know if Parseltongue is considered a...
Yeah, because it's just kind of like a...
There is...
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the time, what I've read about is like, especially with Klingon, it would be like, it's kind of made up for a show and they don't really try to make it a full thing, but then people will go back and like expand and create just being fans because they're like, I want to speak Klingon, so let's look at what evidence we've been given and then build on it.
I wonder if you could mash fanfic and conlang together to make like one word that is comprised of 4 pieces.
Config-lang fan.
I think you'll be we'll task that to you, Steph. You're going to be the first Conlang fanfic creator.
Okay.
But I think we should have a discussion about what a conlang actually is, because at its root we say it's a constructed language. What does that really mean to be a language? Why don't we talk about what a language is to begin with, a natural human language, and what the defining characteristics of those are, and see how different or how similar an actual constructed language would be. Because when I think of a language, I think of it has a vocabulary. There are words that people have to learn or to know to convey ideas. It has a sound system. Sometimes it has an alphabet if it's written, but it can also be signed too. What else do we think of?
I mean, one pretty common definition I think of a language is that it has to have native speakers. So like it has to actually have people who learn it from birth for it to be a language. So I guess that doesn't really apply to constructed languages, except for a few, I guess.
I think that, there are a select few that actually have a community of speakers, and that is the ultimate goal of any language. If it's going to survive and thrive, it needs to be spoken by people. Maybe they're not native speakers, but maybe they're just kind of like hobbyists or people who've learned it on the side, as long as they're keeping it alive. But I think a real human language, of course, has to have native speakers.
So are there babies out there speaking Dothraki right now?
That's a great question.
I don't know. No.
I feel like the contrarian thing would be like, aren't all languages constructed? Because humans had to construct them. So I guess kind of finding the line between that. Because I guess it's just more, when you think constructed language, you think like the person who started speaking it did not start speaking it natively, and they built it somehow out of not just trying to communicate with other people.
Yeah, I think that's the key distinction, is like building it from scratch, and not, the language isn't just naturally evolving from some other source. It's not branching off in some language family to become its own thing, and it's most likely not being learned natively. But I think that later in the episode we'll get to talk about a specific example of a language that was created from scratch that is being learned natively. So we'll get there, but I think that's one of the main distinguishing factors between natural languages and constructed languages. But it's important to note that constructed languages too have, fully fledged ones will have vocabularies, they'll have phonologies or sound systems, they'll have rules that govern how these different parts can come together, which is called grammar. So anyone technically can create a language. That's an important point to remember, as long as it has these defining elements of a language. It doesn't have to be a natural human language.
I also think one of the big differences is that a natural language is sort of like a participative, like, community process, right? Because it's sort of something that kind of cohesively evolves with the input of many people, whereas a conlang is usually the product of one person's imagination. One person is sort of creating the entire system and all of the rules.
Yeah, and I think if you think about people who create conlangs for fictional universes, it's typically one person, and we're about to hear from one person, David J. Peterson, who is the mastermind and the architect behind High Valyrian and Dothraki from Game of Thrones. But like you said, he's the only one who's contributing to this kind of like grand base of knowledge that forms the Dothraki language. He was the sole person who was tasked with or commissioned to do this project. But like language, naturally, like you said, is very collaborative, and it grows and it evolves and it changes with the people who speak it. Well, I just want to give a quick rundown of sort of the history of constructed languages, because it's way older than you might think. We think of like literature from the contemporary era or TV shows and movies, like I keep mentioning, as sort of like the playground for these constructed languages. But I found an example from even the 12th century. There was I don't know if you ever heard of Hildegard von Bingen. She's like a famed mystic and a Catholic saint. And Aylin, you might know more than I do about her, but she kind of became the icon for conlangers over the centuries, because she was one of the first to come up with a language that was used for hymn lyrics, and it had like a sort of masked or disguised script, as well as some words that kind of helped to muddy or blur the meanings of some of the lyrics. She called it lingua ignota. So she's kind of held in high regard as one of the original conlangers, and that was hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And then there's another example that I wrote about for Atlas Obscura a couple years ago of this, what's called a philosophical language, which was created by a philosopher named John Wilkins back in, I think, the 17th century. And he tried to come up with a system that would sort every concept, idea, thing in the universe into 40 different categories. And each category was assigned a syllable, like ti, bo, da, something like that. So you would be able to signify what category, whether it's like, you know, beast or like creature of the earth, that might be a category, or something more general like concept or like state of being might be a category.
It almost reminds me of like the I Ching or like the tarot, where like every single thing in the universe can be sort of like ascribed to like one of like 80 or 78 symbols or something.
Definitely. And it's a big project. It sounds really laborious to kind of split up every single concept of everything, every noun in the universe into these categories.
Yeah.
And then you find you have subcategories as well, and each of those categories has a different sound ascribed to it. So it's like the color green, I think, was T day because T signified color, and then day was like the division of that meant green after T. So if you said T day, then you were conveying green, but of course that just like you have to understand what all of that means to be able to use this language. Anyways, the point is that people have been trying to create conlangs for a long time. And we see a lot of them today because there's just so much media that we're saturated with all the time. But I think this is a process that's been going on for so long. People trying to kind of make language from scratch to make it something that they can use as a supplement to the language they already have for whatever purpose. But getting back to Dothraki and High Valyrian from Game of Thrones, which are some of the most recognized conlangs today, Steph, you interviewed David J. Peterson, who we just mentioned, who was hired to create these languages for the show. And I'm going to play a clip from the interview with him where he talks about the process of creating conlangs.
It's like putting together a puzzle and also building the puzzle pieces that make the puzzle. And so it's very difficult, it's very taxing, and it's the type of thing where, as you can imagine, if you were just trying to create all puzzle pieces by hand, you might find that they don't fit the way that you thought they were going to. Maybe the image is right, but one of the little tabs is too big for where it's supposed to insert to.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the type of thing that happens with language creation. You have a plan, you sit down, you start doing it. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, and maybe some bit that does work very well ends up obscuring another bit or making it not work as well. And so it's a call for endless tinkering to make sure that the system you have works right. And then, of course, even once you've got the system running pretty well, I mean, creating an entire vocabulary is something that can literally last your entire lifetime. No project is ever finished. And so, I mean, unlike with a lot of other art forms, I mean, there's never anything you produce that can't stand to be improved further. It's endless, and that's part of the draw, I think.
Okay, so what are the major reflections that you have listening to that? One thing that stuck with me was like the endless tinkering, the concept of you're never really done. Because when I think of a language, it's so big and so expansive that you could be working on it forever and ever, and there's no right answer. Like, languages are so arbitrary, and what word represents what concept or what sound can be paired with another sound to make a word. Does that also stick out to you, just like how much work it would be to create a conlang in the first place?
Yeah, totally. And also I thought of like, you also need to have for it to be a living language for real, you need to have a system of bringing in new words. Like, for it to be a living language, you have to also be able to say microwave in Dothraki, and like that system needs to be in place also, like apart from all the basic grammar that you need. And then you also probably, for it to be, classified as living, there has to be words that go out of use as well, as we see in natural, like more organically developed languages.
Yeah, I kind of just wonder when you decide like something is developed enough. Because I mean, with Dothraki, it's one thing because he's being given lines that he specifically needs. But if you want more people to use it, how do you know when to release it? Because I feel like for me, I'd be like, all right, this is great. This is perfect, putting it out in the world. And then someone would be like, how do you say microwave? And I'd be like, damn it. So, I don't know. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that stood out to me from my conversation with him is that you really do have to think about the fact that this language has to stand alone on its own and sort of be a cohesive, comprehensive system. Even if you're only, you're creating a language for a movie and there's going to be like 10 sentences and they're talking about this one specific thing, Peterson really cares about having the language sort of stand on its own 2 feet, even if, beyond the requirements of the given project.
So I think that with someone like David J. Peterson, no one's necessarily asking him to create a full language that stands on 2 feet. Mm-hmm. But if you know that people are going to be interested in learning it and forming a little language community to speak in that language, of course you're going to want to give them as much as you can to work with. But like he said, I'm sure it just takes endless tinkering. You have to build out all these vocabularies. You have to make it really, really full so it can live on its own. And it seems like a lot of work. It really does.
Yeah, and I think one of the things is that a lot of these franchises have a really dedicated fan base, and everything has been about just sort of like increasing authenticity and increasing high quality special effects. And I mean, I think there was one movie that sort of set the precedent for having a legitimate conlang, and then everyone else just kind of wanted to copy that. And so basically what he said is that like we're at a point now where like every major project that could benefit from having a conlang is basically doing that and employing people who do this kind of stuff.
Also, just to bring up, I remember I've read the first 2 of the Game of Thrones books, and there is Dothraki in there, but only a few words. And so David J. Peterson had like the sparest of parts that he did have to build into the larger language, but it wasn't a full language until the show came out, which I found kind of interesting. Because in a book, you can kind of just say, blah, blah, Daenerys said in High Valyrian, but when you're in a TV show, it kind of takes you out of it if everyone's just speaking the same language. Like when you're watching a show about Russia and everyone's speaking in an English accent for some reason.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about the community of speakers who are actually learning these languages for fun and as a hobby, because they're out there and they exist. And I actually talked to one. He's a YouTuber named Ben Dumond. His name is Ben Wood, but his username on YouTube is Ben Dumond, Ben of the World. And he's a really big language learner. He's super big into learning conlangs as well as natural languages, but he's also experimented with making a few conlangs of his own. So I'm going to play some clips from the interview that I had with him where he talks about why he started learning conlangs in the first place, what they mean to him, and what they've helped him learn about natural languages too. So the first thing that we kind of talked about was why he would want to get into learning a conlang in the first place and why other people would as well.
Some people create a language and they don't expect anyone to learn it. This is just like a personal exercise to just kind of, express yourself artistically. In other cases like Dothraki, it's brought about by popular media. And just from that fact alone, there's already this community who, follows this TV show. And then you can say, oh, well, in this TV show, they speak Dothraki. And, it'd be kind of fun if, this group of people who enjoy the show could also speak it and kind of, use it as a fun little language. But then there are some constructed languages that are meant to be spoken by a lot of people. So auxiliary languages like Esperanto, the goal of that language was to be a global, second language for people.
So we'll get to Esperanto later, but I really liked his point about the fact that some people just like to learn conlangs because they want to be a part of something. Like they belong to a fan base already of, in this case, Game of Thrones, but another way for them to explore that community and connect with it is to learn the language that is a defining characteristic of the show itself. Did anything stand out to you about that clip?
I just think it's so hard to learn a language that lots of people speak. The idea of learning for a fan community is just so wild to me. Because, like, I think of learning Spanish, and I'm like, it's so hard. But there are people who are becoming fluent with these languages that only maybe a few hundred other people speak. And it's for fun. It's a different mindset that fascinates me.
Yeah, one thing that he and I talked about was, and we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, was that you need a community of speakers to be able to practice. If the language is going to live and thrive and even survive, you need just to have people that you can practice it with for your own sake too. If you want to be able to get better and become fluent in the language, whatever fluency means to you, you can't just do it by yourself. You can't just look at YouTube tutorials and read books. You have to be able to get together with other people and practice just like you would with any natural language.
Yeah.
So it seems like more of a challenge to learn a conlang for sure.
I'm sure there are some people who would actually find it appealing that there are so few speakers of it. Because they're like, so edgy, I speak this super cool made-up language.
But other people would look on and say, well, I think that's so impractical of you. I'm judging you. Like, it seems like a waste of time for you to have done that because there's no one else to speak it with. And I don't necessarily respect you for knowing it.
You have people to speak it with. It's just probably in your own little, like, WhatsApp group. I don't know.
And we'll say the fact that nerd culture has come to the forefront must be great for people who speak Klingon, for example, because in like the 90s, this was like the worst. Now I feel like you've got people who are like, that's pretty cool, even if they're not part of it, though it still is not practical, but not everything in life has to be.
No. I mean, you could also argue, why would you learn Icelandic, for instance, which has like, I don't know, 400,000 native speakers, but people do that too. So, yeah.
I think it's all about the mental challenge and connecting with the people that you want to connect with. If they have a skill or they know something that you don't, and you really want to be able to join that community, I guess it's a way to really jump in head first. And it's kind of like an in-group, out-group identifier too. If you know, with natural languages as well, if you know a language really well, that instantly gives you a new way to connect with people and communicate with them in ways you couldn't before.
Also, I think it's a great opportunity for creativity, right? Because Dothraki, High Valyrian, Klingon, all of them, they are, as we said, maybe not fully developed in a way that, like, I mean, they have the basics, but as we said, maybe you don't know how to say microwave. So, like, you can be part of that community by adding on bit by bit. Probably. I don't know how it works in those communities, but I'm guessing there must be some sort of space for innovation, even now.
Yeah, I am curious about that now. I don't know if it's just like microwave is a loan word from English.
Maybe that is the case.
So I'm going to play another clip from the same interview with Ben Wood, and he kind of talked about how conlanging, either creating or learning conlangs, has helped him understand human natural languages better, which I think is really interesting. So see what you think.
It can be kind of difficult to create a constructed language that feels authentic and that feels different from a language that you already know. Because most people don't think of the, deep structural mechanics that make up English and Spanish or Mandarin. So developing a conlang, you learn about these deeper structures and you learn to appreciate the complexity of natural languages more, I think. It can be similar if you're just learning a constructed language as well. You have to, learn these new concepts. So maybe your language doesn't have an accusative case. So if you're learning Esperanto, you have to learn about the accusative, how it functions and everything. And, that could help you in the future if you're learning maybe German or Russian. So, yeah, it can be kind of daunting if you, don't have a lot of time to learn these new concepts. But it's really interesting, and I think it opens up your mind to, the diversity of language and how all these languages function.
I think you raised some really good points, especially about learning a conlang being a fun mental exercise, not necessarily fun all the time, but one that helps to stimulate your mind and help you understand your own language better, and then even to learn new natural languages too. What do you think?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, what I know about Dothraki and High Valyrian is that they aren't that simple grammar-wise. I think they have lots of cases and genders, and that's also interesting when you create a language that is, in many cases, then more complex or in a completely different way than your native language. I guess Peterson's native language is English, and that he would bring in so many grammatical concepts that are very foreign to him. That's very interesting, but it does create, I mean, it adds something to the language, that it has something, strange or mystical about it from an English speaker's perspective. So I definitely think that learning, but creating a constructed language must be so interesting for a grammar nerd.
Yeah, no, I think one of the rookie mistakes I made when I was talking to Peterson, I asked him, I was like, so what do you do? Like, what's your process? Do you just borrow some of the grammar from Japanese and throw in some syntax from German? And he's like, no. That is a rookie mistake. You do not just do a Frankenstein mishmash of the world's existing natural languages. It has to be an organic process. And actually, kind of speaking to your point, he was kind of saying you don't have to know multiple languages to create a conlang, but it certainly helps, because the more languages you know, the less likely you are to sort of unconsciously recreate some of the things you take for granted, just because, in English, you would place the word the. Every language has it, but every language also kind of has a different way of using it, like a sentence order. Those are all kinds of things that you never really question until you start learning more languages. So it broadens your scope of what's possible.
Yeah.
I think that the clip that we just played from Ben and the conversation we're having touch a lot on the accessibility of conlanging. The question of, is it something that anyone can do? Do you need to know a lot of other natural human languages to be able to do it? Do you need a formal training in linguistics? Like you said, do you need to be able to take the syntax from one language and the vocabulary or the morphology from another? What does it take to make a conlang, and can anyone do it? So I talked to Ben about that as well. I think he had something really insightful to say too, so I'll play that.
I absolutely think that everyone has the capability to learn or even create their own language. There are lots of resources out there. I know David Peterson, the guy who invented Dothraki, has a book out called The Art of Language Invention, and that's a really good introduction to kind of the whole process. And there's also the Language Construction Kit, which has been online for maybe a decade now. And so there's tons of resources. There's this huge online community. So even on social media spaces like Reddit or Facebook, there are constructed language communities that new people can ask linguistic questions. So if they're not really sure how the locative case works, they can ask these communities and get a comprehensive answer that they can use to help develop their own languages.
Yeah, I think it's cool that he's trying to encourage other people to get involved and get started learning or creating conlangs in whatever ways they can. He seems like he's trying to say that the barrier to entry isn't actually all that high, because there are other people out there who are doing the same things, and they come from all different skill levels as well.
Yeah.
I think the Conlang community reminds me a lot of DIY communities and such, because it's these people who are interested in this topic, and they kind of take it apart, and they'll start with English, and then they'll realize English is not the extent of all language. I think linguistics as a field had this problem for a little bit, where there were so many studies and they were all done on English, and they made these broad proclamations about this is what language does. And then someone who speaks Japanese would come in and be like, not in this one. And just, there's so much that language can do, and when you only are in one language, you're kind of confined. But thanks to the internet, now you can find out how Hungarian cases work very easily.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think conlanging has definitely become more of a collaborative effort, because there's just so much access to people who come from different linguistic backgrounds or study language in a different context, or maybe don't even study language but are fluent speakers of something that you've never even heard of, but can offer some cool new insight into how languages work, how they're different, how they're similar, and how you might be able to incorporate that into your own language creation journey. And you said something about the DIY community and kind of picking apart languages to like just look at them and fit them together like a puzzle. And that reminds me of what David J. Peterson said, like the endless tinkering. It's kind of just like, yeah, communities of enthusiasts of like, I'm imagining like people who really like cars, just like taking them apart and getting to know their parts. You can try to build a car by yourself based on what you think you know about cars, the ones that you've owned in your lifetime, but having other people to kind of like, having the tools to be able to take a car apart and look at the pieces and like play around with them, maybe build something even different from those parts too. I mean, it's helpful to have other people who know different sides of the story and can offer insights and knowledge that you don't have. So we've talked about languages that were created for fictional universes, but what about the ones that were designed for use in real life? We'll talk about those after the break. Multilinguish is brought to you by Babbel, the language app. Okay, it's time for a language learning lightning round. You snap your fingers and you can be fluent in any language. Which language would it be and why? Thomas?
I think I would go with Norwegian because, first of all, it's a language I've never studied before. Because I could choose Spanish, but like I have a basis there. So like, why would I waste that time if I would have gotten this genie wish later on? And I just think Norway is a very beautiful country, and I would love to go around to the small villages and not have to affront them with my English.
Dylan, what about you?
I would pick Brazilian Portuguese because, for one thing, Portuguese is a super cool sounding language that seems to like mix a bunch of different languages in one. And also on the shallow end because Brazilian people are extremely attractive and I want to date them all. That's all.
Reason enough? What about you, Jen?
I would choose French because I finally want to be able to be in France and order food and drink, and I'm basic and I'm owning it. But I've studied it for so long and I still am not fluent, so I would like to just like be able to check that box and snap my fingers and be fluent in French.
Those are all great answers. Thank you for sharing. Babbel's lessons are lovingly created by over 100 language experts who are real people and not just a translation machine. We're offering Multilinguish listeners 50% off a 3-month subscription, and new customers can get this offer by visiting babbel.com/podcast. That's BABBEL.com/podcast. So let's transition now into talking about languages that aren't made for pop culture, but are actually made for use in real life. So this is kind of a weird thing, I guess, to think about, because when you have 7,000 human languages that exist or have existed in the world, why would you need to create one for people to speak? But that's the question that Esperanto is trying to answer. And Ben Wood mentioned Esperanto earlier in the episode, and for good reason. It's probably the most well-known and most recognized constructed language by far. And this is one that is designed to be used by real people in real-world contexts, not just for a movie or for a book. But the history of Esperanto is really, really fascinating because it's existed for more than 100 years, and it's gone through periods of revival and resurgence, but also kind of being going into hiding a little bit. But the mission behind it is just so fascinating. It's designed to be an international auxiliary language, one that all people from all walks of life can learn to speak and can come together and use to build human community and to break down barriers, mostly linguistic, but nationalistic, geographic, that keep people separated. So let's talk about what we know about Esperanto. I'll give us the history, and then we can fill in the gaps if there's anything else that you have to add. But it started in 1887. There was a Polish doctor, a medical doctor named L.L. Zamenhof, and he was a polyglot himself, so he spoke, I think, around 5 languages fluently. I think his native languages were Polish and Russian. And he lived through a period of intense nationalism on the rise throughout the European continent, but even like imperialism and colonialism around the world, stemming mostly from Europe. But what he wanted to do was to find a way for humans to focus on what brought them together and less on what drove them apart. So he designed this language, Esperanto, which was supposed to be, like I said, an international auxiliary language, a universal one that anyone could learn, that would draw on different elements from languages around the world. So people would be able to learn it as like a second, not necessarily as a first language, but as a second one. So in addition to their first languages, they could come together and communicate with the rest of the world using the second language. It kind of died out a little bit between the world wars, but it's seeing sort of a resurgence or a revival over the past couple decades. Today it has about 2 million speakers to some degree, so that's not fluency at all, but there are people who are definitely fluent in Esperanto, and there are even around 1,000 or so native speakers who grew up since birth speaking the language and can speak it fluently. So it's a really interesting case study, and I don't know what you all know about it beyond that, but it is, I think, one of the coolest just examples of a social experiment that I can think of, and one that has a really, really fascinating history. And I want to play a clip for you of Esperanto as well. This is from, he's a speaker who's been speaking it for about 20 years. His name is Thomas Alexander. In Esperanto, he calls himself Tomaso. And he has a YouTube channel called The Esperanto Variety Show, which is about sharing the joys of learning Esperanto and the challenges, getting other people to recognize how cool it can be and why it's worthwhile. So like I said, he speaks the language every day at home to his kids. He's fluent in it. And here's a clip of him speaking Esperanto. And I want you to try to think of what languages this reminds you of, if there's anything that you can pick out that stands out to you. And here it is.
Kiam mi klopodas aranĝi tion, mi vidas ke mankas kelkaj partoj. Do mi faros tion hodiaŭ. Mi faros aliajn partojn por ĉu ne kompletigi tiun filmeton pri la diversaj vortoj kiujn mi uzis por priskribi la partojn de la tegmento kaj simile.
So what stood out to you? What did you pick up on in that clip of Esperanto?
I heard Spanish and German a little bit.
Okay.
It felt Russian, but I think that was a lot of the accent kind of gave it a Russian flavor. And also Portuguese kind of.
Yeah, a little bit of that. I got that.
So Esperanto, it's supposed to draw on a lot of different world languages to make it accessible to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But I think some people have kind of bemoaned the fact that it seems to be more European like centric and oriented. So I also heard a lot of what seemed to be like Latin derived words that then made their way into Spanish or Portuguese. Like I heard him say diversa, something about completa. I don't speak Esperanto, so this is all just me like using the Spanish that I know and the limited German. But like you said, Thomas, I also heard a little bit of Russian. Something sounded Slavic to me. What I didn't really get a sense of was a lot of Asian languages. And I think there's been, if anyone were to criticize Esperanto, it's probably for the fact that it's more, heavily inclined to pull from the Romance language families or the Germanic language families.
Yeah.
So maybe that means it's not as accessible to everyone. But people who learn Esperanto often say that it takes about a third of the time to learn as it would to learn a language like Spanish or French. So the idea is that it's very, very simplified. The grammar is extremely consistent and regular. I don't think there are any irregularities. They all follow the same rules. Every word does, the affixes for the endings, the case markings, all of that is supposed to be really, really easy to pick up so that there's no major barrier to access for anyone who wants to learn the language. So what do you think about Esperanto as a whole, as an experiment, as an idea, as a living language, knowing that 2 million people speak it today to some degree? What are your thoughts on that? Because I think it's just, there's so much to unpack here about it.
One of the only facts that I know about it is that George Soros is a native speaker, and George Soros is like a big liberal donor, and that's weird. That's random.
I'm sure there are people who love that in the world.
He's often a pratfall for conservatives, I guess. Anyway, but that's not much about the language itself. I find it interesting because I think a lot of people kind of use English as an international auxiliary language today because there's just so many people. In an episode before, I talked, I believe, with Elin about how English is just kind of the go-to when you want to learn a second language because so many people speak it. But that does give a lot of privilege to people who are born speaking English, because then it's like they don't have to learn another thing, and that kind of centers English. So I like the idea of like having this neutral ground language that everyone just knows. I just don't know how it would work if you actually tried to apply, because it seems like since it's simplified, it probably doesn't have the same expressiveness as like a French or Chinese or any other language. I don't know. It's like a fun thought experiment.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it can express many things, and I suppose that it is ever evolving also, since it has even, native speakers. But it is definitely difficult to, because, as you said, now English sort of fills this role globally, at least to some extent. And if we would want to, replace that with Esperanto, it's very difficult to imagine how that would be done. It would have to be a very top-down sort of process, which is not really how languages work. But the thought behind it definitely, because it's better for everyone to learn a completely different language and an easy one than, maybe taking on a language that's already existing and, as you say, giving the native speakers of that language very much.
Yeah.
It seems like it would, if we were to take English, which already serves as kind of like the world's universal language, and just mandate that everyone learn that, that's not inherently fair because it gives English speakers an advantage. But if you take Esperanto, which is supposed to be sort of like a neutral ground, like you said, Thomas, for everyone to learn, I mean, how much work would that take to make everyone in the world, the 7 billion people, learn a second language? That's also a different question.
Massive.
It's like, there's no easy way to approach this question. And then you can ask, well, is it worth it to have everyone speak the same language to begin with? A lot of people will say, yes, of course, it's great that humankind can come together and be able to communicate on the same terms. But other people who are probably less, maybe more conservative about, the sweeping tides of globalism, and would think that, oh no, you grow up speaking a certain language to connect with the people in your community and your country and your nation, but beyond that, we shouldn't try to bring people together because that's not human nature. It's just I'm sure people could debate this topic for hours and hours, and they have for years, decades, millennia even. It's just a really fascinating question for me, like how do you propose the idea of a universal human language, one that's an auxiliary, without stepping on a lot of toes or making people put in the extra work when a lot of people are not going to be happy or wouldn't even see the value in that to begin with?
Well, I think the fact that so many people in the world speak English necessarily resulted in English, or came from English speakers stepping on a lot of toes. I mean, historically.
No. There's also this kind of interesting idea about language tax, that countries or communities that speak, say, English would pay a tax to cover other language communities' costs of teaching English, learning English, translating, etc. That's also an interesting idea, I think.
Is this something being proposed?
No, I mean, it's an old idea. I don't even know how old it is, but it's out there. It's probably not that. I can't see anyone arguing for it, but it's an interesting. I mean, because it makes you think about the advantage that English actually has.
Yeah.
Well, what do we think about the community of speakers of Esperanto? It seems like if you're going to learn any constructed language, Esperanto is by far the most recognized and the most spoken across the world. So it seems like the highest payoff if you want to find other people who speak it. I mean, there are worldwide annual conferences about Esperanto specifically. There are hundreds and I'm sure thousands of books that are published either about or in Esperanto itself. So the resources are there, and the community of speakers is there too. Do you think that that is enough of a reason to learn Esperanto because you have people to practice with and you have ways to learn? Or what do you think? Are you inclined to pick up an Esperanto book or watch maybe a YouTube video one night a week for a long time to become acquainted with the language? Would you be willing to travel to a conference and meet other speakers Do you feel like it's a worthwhile endeavor for you?
Not for me personally. I think I would rather construct my own language.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate the community that they have, and I think it's really interesting what they're doing. But it's probably not going to be as big as Zamenhof or whatever his name was thought.
But I think that we all seem to agree that it's probably more worthwhile to learn, you know, if you're an English speaker living in the US, probably more worthwhile to learn Spanish, for example, than it is to learn Esperanto if you had to choose one.
Yeah. But I mean, 2 million speakers is nothing to sneeze at. I mean, there's so many languages in the world that have so many fewer speakers than that.
Exactly. Well, I think that wraps it up for this episode. We've covered a lot of ground. We talked about languages in pop culture, and we talked about languages that are designed to be used by real people in the real world. And so conlangs cover a huge gamut of practical purposes or just sort of creative expression. They exist for a lot of different reasons, as we've talked about, but there's no right way or wrong way to learn one or to make one even. And it seems like for people who are interested in learning more or creating their own, it actually doesn't seem that hard to do. So I encourage any listeners who are wanting to know more to read the articles that we have on Babbel magazine about conlanging, to look at YouTube videos. There's plenty out there. We have an interview transcript with David J. Peterson as well, who talks about some of the process. So there's lots of ways to get involved with conlanging and to dip your feet in the water, to figure it out whether you like it or not. Seems like a really fun endeavor.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yep.
Any final thoughts?
Yeah. If you do read the Peterson interview, you should read the full transcript because there's a great part in there where his cat pukes on the floor and the transcriber kept it in. So
that's reason enough for me.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks to Elin, to Thomas, and to Steph. And thanks to you, dear listener. Bye.
Bye.
Multilinguish is produced by the content team at Babbel. We are
Thomas Moore Devlin.
David Duchin.
Steph Koifman.
Dylan Lyons.
And I'm Jen Jordan. Ruben Vilash makes us sound good. Our logo was designed by Ali Zhao. You can read more about today's episode topic and more on Babbel magazine. Just visit babbel.com/magazine. Say hi on social media by finding us at Babbel USA, all one word. Finally, please rate and review this podcast. We really appreciate it.
I could do my rendition of Esperanto to the tune of Desperado. If we need more music in the episode.
Go for it.
Esperanto, you'd better come to your senses. You've been out riding fences for so long now. I won't go on.
You have a beautiful voice.
Yeah,
Thank you.
do. Yeah.
Wow.
That's why I sing constantly, and not because I have anxiety.
I think we just found our blooper.
Don't sue me, band that sings Desperado. Is it? It's not the Eagles.
No,
I'm
it
sure
is,
they'd be listening to this podcast.
You never know.
Yeah.